There is a room in the back of every archive where the dust does not settle the way it should. The shelves are taller than a man. The ledgers are bound in cracked leather. And on one shelf, behind a brass lock that has been forced open more than once, there is a wooden cabinet. On its door, painted in old red lacquer that has begun to flake, there is a single word: false. I am Mortimer Quill. I keep this room. I keep these papers. And tonight, I am going to take down 6 folders from that cabinet, lay them on this table in front of you, and walk you through what is inside each one. Some leaders died and stayed dead. They were buried, mourned, forgotten, replaced. The world moved on. But 6 did not. 6 are filed here, in this cabinet, because their deaths were a performance, a trick, a lie repeated so many times by so many people that for a while it became truer than the truth.
You are going to meet a Tsar who may have walked away from his own funeral and lived for 30 more years in a Siberian hut. A king who rode into a battle in Africa and never came back, even though everyone agreed he was killed. A Cossack with a scar on his chest who insisted, against all sense, that he was the murdered emperor of Russia. A frightened young woman pulled out of a Berlin canal who refused for 60 years to give her real name. A 10-year-old boy crowned king in Dublin Cathedral while the real prince he was pretending to be sat alive in the Tower of London. And a young man so beautiful, so well-dressed, so perfectly mannered that for 8 years half the courts of Europe paid him as if he were the rightful heir to the English throne. 6 folders, 6 false deaths, 6 stories that almost rewrote history. Look closer. The first folder. The oldest of them is on top. The first folder belongs to Tsar Alexander I of Russia, the man who beat Napoleon. The man who walked through the ashes of Moscow in 1812 and watched his own city burn rather than surrender it. The man who entered Paris at the head of his armies and made the Bourbons return to their throne. The most powerful Christian ruler in Europe in his generation, and, by the end of his life, a man who could not look at his own face in a mirror without seeing blood on it. You have to understand how Alexander came to power. His father was Tsar Paul I. Paul was strange, suspicious, perhaps unwell, and he had been making enemies among the officers of the St. Petersburg garrison for years. In March of 1801, a group of those officers entered the Mikhailovsky Palace at night. There was a struggle. Paul did not survive it. Alexander was 23 years old. He was in the same palace. He had been told by the conspirators that his father would be forced to abdicate, nothing more. That, at least, is the story he told himself for the rest of his life. The next morning, when the body of his father was carried out, and Alexander was told he was now emperor, he is said to have collapsed and wept like a child. Members of his household had to lift him up and place the imperial mantle on his shoulders. He could not stop saying one phrase: "They lied to me. They lied to me." He never recovered from that night, not entirely. He ruled for 24 years. He won the greatest military victories in Russian history up to that point. He was admired across Europe as a liberator. But there are letters from his closest advisors, men like Prince Adam Czartoryski and the writer Karamzin, in which they describe an emperor who could not sleep, an emperor who had begun fasting like a monk, an emperor who in his last years would not allow mirrors in his private rooms. He had become deeply religious in a way that frightened the established church. He spoke of withdrawing from the world. He hinted, more than once, that the burden of the crown was a punishment, that God had given it to him as the price for his father. In the autumn of 1825, Alexander left St. Petersburg for the south. His wife, Empress Elizabeth Alexeyevna, was unwell, and the doctors had recommended the warmer climate of the Black Sea coast. They went to Taganrog, a small port town, simple, sleepy, far from the capital. There, on the 1st of December 1825, the world was told that Tsar Alexander I was dead. He was 47 years old. The official cause was typhus, contracted, it was said, during a trip he made to inspect a fortress in the Crimea. Now begin the strange details.
the body of the Tsar was prepared for the journey back to the capital. Ordinarily, the Russian autocrat would be buried with his face uncovered, displayed in his coffin so that the people could see and mourn him. This time, that did not happen. The coffin was sealed in Taganrog. When it arrived in Moscow weeks later, after a slow procession across the empire, the lid was opened only once, briefly, in private, for senior officials and close family. The face inside, those who saw it whispered later, was darkened, swollen, almost unrecognizable. Some of the imperial relatives, after viewing the body, are reported to have said quietly that the face did not look like Alexander. The empress, his wife, did not return to the capital with the coffin. She remained in the south. She herself died only 6 months later, in May of 1826, before she could be questioned about anything she had seen. The funeral was held at Saints Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg. The coffin was lowered into the imperial vault. The empire moved on.
There was a brief crisis of succession, the Decembrist uprising on the day Alexander's brother Nicholas was crowned. Russia turned its attention to other things. For about 10 years, no one publicly questioned the death of Alexander I. And then, in 1836, in a small village in western Siberia called Krasnofimsk, a man was arrested for vagrancy. He was tall. He was elderly but not frail. He was dressed as a peasant pilgrim with a long beard, simple cloth, leather sandals. He carried no papers. He spoke Russian beautifully, with the accent of an educated nobleman of St. Petersburg. The local police questioned him. He gave them only one name, Fyodor Kuzmich. He would not say where he had come from. He would not say who he had been. He admitted that he was guilty of having no documents. He accepted, calmly, his punishment. He was flogged 20 times with the lash and sentenced to exile in the Tomsk region of Siberia, which is where he wanted to go anyway. For the next 28 years, Fyodor Kuzmich lived in small wooden cells built for him by various wealthy merchants of the region. He prayed. He read the scriptures. He spoke with extraordinary insight about events of European politics from the time of Napoleon. He could quote, in French, long passages of memoirs that no peasant pilgrim should ever have read. He wept when certain saints' days came around, particularly the days associated with Tsar Paul I. He refused, all his life, to have his portrait painted. When he was finally persuaded by a wealthy benefactor, the portrait that survives shows an old man with the unmistakable features of the Romanov family: the long, straight nose, the pale eyes, the heavy brow. He died in 1864 in a hut outside Tomsk. Local people had been visiting him for years to ask his blessing. After his death, his cell was searched. Among his few belongings, 2 things were found that have never been satisfactorily explained. The first was a small chain with an engraved cross of a kind worn by the imperial family. The second was a piece of paper covered in a code of letters and numbers that no one in the region could read. The paper survives. The code has never been solved. The local rumor, which spread first quietly and then loudly, was simple. Fyodor Kuzmich was Tsar Alexander I. The Tsar had not died at Taganrog. The body in the coffin had been someone else, an officer of his guard, a courier, a man of similar build who had died of fever in the same week. The Tsar, exhausted by his crown, by the death of his father, by the sin he had carried on his soul for 24 years, had used the cover of the official death to disappear into the only thing he had ever wanted, a life of penance. The Russian government denied this story for decades. But there are records that survive in the archive of the Romanov dynasty showing that Tsar Alexander II, a nephew of the original Alexander, traveled secretly to Tomsk in the 1870s and spent time at the cell where Fyodor Kuzmich had lived. There are records that show that the very last Tsar, Nicholas II, kept on his desk a small icon that had belonged to Fyodor Kuzmich. There are records that in 1921, after the revolution, Soviet investigators opened the imperial vault at Saints Peter and Paul Cathedral as part of a survey of Romanov tombs. They reported in their internal documents, which were not declassified until the 1990s,
that the coffin of Alexander I was empty. Empty. In 2015, a team of Russian forensic researchers requested permission to compare the handwriting of Tsar Alexander, preserved in his many letters and proclamations, with the handwriting of Fyodor Kuzmich, preserved in surviving notes from his cell. The first preliminary report, leaked to the Russian press, suggested the two hands were the same. The follow-up study has, so far, not been allowed. Maybe it is a coincidence. Maybe the empty coffin is a story invented by the Soviets who hated the Romanovs and wanted to embarrass them in death. Maybe the handwriting analysis was wrong. Maybe Fyodor Kuzmich was an extremely well-educated runaway officer who happened to look like a member of the imperial family. Or maybe the most powerful man in Europe in the year 1825 walked away from his crown, faked his own funeral, and lived for 38 more years in a wooden hut, doing the only thing he ever wanted: praying for forgiveness. I have held the Fyodor Kuzmich file in my hands for many years now. I do not know what to believe, but I know that this is the only folder in this cabinet on which the imperial seal of the Russian Empire was placed by a hand that was still living when the seal was applied. Because someone in the late 19th century, working inside the Romanov household, decided that this folder was important enough to mark with the personal sigil of a Tsar. I will let you decide who that was. Close the folder. The second folder is heavier than the first. It is bound with a strip of leather that has darkened with age, and on its cover there is a small tear, as if someone tried to pull it open with their teeth. This one belongs to a king who rode into the desert and never came back. His name was Sebastian I of Portugal, and the people of Portugal waited for him to return for 300 years. Sebastian was born in 1554. He was the only legitimate male heir of the House of Aviz, the dynasty that had built the Portuguese Empire into one of the largest the world had ever seen. The empire stretched from Brazil to Goa to Macau. It controlled the spice trade, the gold trade, the slave trade. And by the time Sebastian inherited the throne at the age of 14, it was beginning to crack at the seams. He was a strange boy. He was tall, he was pale. He had been raised by Jesuits in conditions that we would today call extreme. He fasted constantly. He prayed several hours a day. He believed himself, sincerely, to be a knight of God in the same tradition as the medieval crusaders of 300 years earlier. He read the chronicles of the Knights Templar. He kept a sword by his bed. He believed that his destiny was to lead a holy war against the Muslim kingdoms of North Africa. His advisors begged him not to. The Portuguese throne could not afford another foreign campaign. The treasury was empty. The nobility was tired. There was no obvious enemy to fight, but Sebastian, 24 years old, refused to listen. In the summer of 1578, he assembled an army of around 17,000 men. He drained the treasury of his kingdom completely. He hired German mercenaries, Italian condottieri, Spanish adventurers. He even pawned the crown jewels to pay for muskets and powder. And in late June of 1578, he set sail from Lisbon for the coast of Morocco. He had been invited, in a sense. There was a civil war among the Saudi dynasty of Morocco. A deposed sultan, Abu Abdallah Muhammad II, had asked the Portuguese for help recovering his throne. Sebastian saw it as a sign from God. He would restore a deposed prince, plant the cross over Marrakesh, and write his name into the chronicles of Christendom. His advisors, even his own uncle, Cardinal Henry, begged him on their knees to turn back. He refused. On the 4th of August, 1578, on a plain in northern Morocco called Alcácer Kibir, between two rivers, in the worst possible terrain for European cavalry, Sebastian's army met the army of the new Sultan, Abd al-Malik. The Moroccan force was twice the size of the Portuguese. The day was hot beyond description. The Portuguese soldiers had been marching for days in heavy armor under a sun that few of them had ever experienced. Many were already dying of heat stroke before the first arrow flew. The battle lasted only 4 hours. It was a slaughter. 3 kings died on that field. Sultan Abd al-Malik died of illness in his tent during the fighting. The deposed Sultan, Muhammad, drowned trying to flee across one of the rivers. and Sebastian I of Portugal was last seen charging directly into a wall of Moroccan cavalry, his white plume of feathers visible above the dust, his sword raised, his horse rearing. After the battle, Moroccan soldiers searched the field for the body of the Portuguese king. They found a body wearing royal armor, badly mutilated. They sent it back to Portugal under a flag of truce, and it was placed, eventually, in a tomb in the Geronimos Monastery in Lisbon, where it remains to this day. The tomb is marked with the name of Sebastian, but here is the problem. The body could not be identified with certainty. The face was destroyed. The armor had been stripped and changed hands several times before it reached the family. Some of the senior Portuguese nobles who had survived the battle and were ransomed back to Portugal years later refused to confirm that the body in the tomb was the king. One of them, Cristóvão de Tavora, who had been Sebastian's closest companion since childhood, said in writing that the body returned was not the body of the king he had served. He said it was the body of one of the king's pages, a young man of similar build who had worn similar armor. And so, in the weeks and months and years after the battle, a strange thing began to grow in Portugal. The country had no king. Sebastian had no children. His uncle, the elderly Cardinal Henry, took the throne briefly and died 2 years later. Without a clear heir, the Spanish king, Philip II, who was Sebastian's cousin, marched into Lisbon in 1580 and annexed the entire Portuguese Empire to Spain. The Portuguese, overnight, lost their independence. They would not get it back for 60 years. And in those 60 years of foreign rule, a belief took hold in the cities and the villages and the fishing ports of Portugal that became one of the most powerful messianic movements in early modern Europe. The belief that Sebastian was not dead. That on a foggy morning, on a beach somewhere on the Atlantic coast, the king would return on a white horse, riding out of the sea mist, and free his country from the Spanish. This belief had a name, Sebastianismo, and it produced impostors. 4 of them in the years after the battle. The first appeared in 1584, only 6 years after Alcácer Quibir, in the small town of Peñamacor in central Portugal. He was a young man, the son of a poor potter. He claimed to be the king, returned in secret. He gathered followers. He was arrested by the Spanish authorities and sent to the galleys for life. The second appeared in 1585. He was a hermit who lived in caves outside Ericeira. He claimed that he had been Sebastian's squire on the day of the battle, and that he had personally seen the king escape into the desert and travel to Italy in disguise. He gathered hundreds of followers. He was hanged. The third was the most dangerous. He appeared in 1594 in the town of Madrigal de las Altas Torres in Spain itself. He was a former pastry cook named Gabriel de Espinosa. He had remarkable knowledge of court etiquette, of military matters, of details of the campaign in Africa. He attracted the attention of a noblewoman, Doña Ana of Austria, who was a niece of King Philip himself, living as a nun in a convent at Madrigal. She wrote letters to Espinosa, addressing him as her cousin, the King of Portugal. The conspiracy reached the highest levels. When Philip II discovered what was happening, Espinosa was executed. Doña Ana was placed under house arrest for the rest of her life. The fourth, called the False Sebastian of Venice, appeared in 1598. He was a tall, pale, well-spoken man in his early 40s, exactly the age the real Sebastian would have been. He arrived in Venice claiming that he had been a captive in Persia and the Holy Land for 20 years, and that he had now returned to claim his throne. He was so convincing that the Venetian government wrote to Madrid for instructions. He was eventually handed over to Spanish authorities, sent to a galley, and disappears from the records around 1603. None of them was, almost certainly, the real king. The real king was almost certainly the young man buried in Hieronymus. But the belief did not die when each impostor died. The belief grew. By the 1700s, Sebastianismo had become a genuine folk religion in parts of Portugal and Brazil. Theologians wrote treatises about the day of the king's return. Poems were written. Children were taught to watch the Western Sea. As late as the late 19th century, in the dry interior of northeastern Brazil, an entire town called Canudos, founded by a mystic named Antonio Conselheiro, awaited the return of King Sebastian. When the Brazilian army destroyed Canudos in 1897, killing perhaps 25,000 people, many of the dying still believed that Sebastian would arrive in the morning to save them. 3 centuries. 3 centuries of waiting for a man to ride out of the fog. You see why I keep this folder in this cabinet. The face in the tomb is a face that no one can confirm. The belief that the king escaped is older than most countries. And in the margin of one of the papers in this folder, written in the 17th century by a Portuguese chronicler whose name has been worn away, there is one sentence in Latin. He waits. The night is long. Close it. Set it aside. Stay with me, friend. The third folder is much smaller. It barely fills my hand. But this one costs more lives than the first 2 combined. This folder belongs to a Cossack. His name was Yemelyan Ivanovich Pugachev. He was born around 1742 in a small Don Cossack settlement called Zimoveyskaya. He could barely read. He could barely write. He had served in the Russian army during the 7 Years' War and the war against the Turks. He had a scar on his chest from a bayonet wound. He had a wife. He had 2 children. By the time he reached his early 30s, he had deserted from the army twice, been arrested twice, and escaped twice. He was nothing. He was a man the empire would not have noticed if he had died in a ditch. But in 1773, in the wilderness east of the Volga, Yemelyan Pugachev did something that changed his life and almost destroyed an empire. He stood up in front of a small group of Yike Cossacks and announced that he was not Yemelyan Pugachev at all. He was Tsar Peter III of Russia, the husband of Empress Catherine the Great, the man whom everyone in Russia believed had been murdered 11 years earlier in a coup that placed Catherine on the throne. You need to understand who Peter III was, and why his death was the soft spot in the empire that Pugachev pressed. Peter III was the grandson of Peter the Great. He was raised in Germany. He came to Russia as a teenager, barely speaking the language, and was married to a young German princess who would later become Catherine. He ruled Russia for 6 months in 1762. During those 6 months, he did several things that made the Russian nobility hate him, and several things that made the Russian peasantry love him. He pulled Russia out of the 7 Years' War, betraying his own armies and giving back conquered territory to Prussia, which the nobles considered shameful. But he also abolished the secret police, freed the old believers from religious persecution, and freed the nobility from compulsory state service, which had a downstream effect that the peasants understood very well. They began to hope that their own emancipation might follow. Then, on the 28th of June, 1762, his wife Catherine, with the support of the Imperial Guard regiments, overthrew him. He was arrested. He was sent to a country estate at Ropsha, and on the 17th of July, 8 days later, he was, according to the official story, taken ill suddenly with a violent attack of hemorrhoids, which complicated into a fatal seizure. The official letter announcing his death is a masterpiece of bureaucratic embarrassment. Almost no one in Russia believed it. He had been strangled. Probably by Alexei Orlov, the brother of Catherine's lover. The rumor traveled through every village within a year, but here is what mattered for Pugachev. The peasantry of Russia, especially the Cossacks of the southeastern frontier, and the Old Believer communities and the recently conquered Bashkir and Tatar peoples, did not believe that Peter III was dead. They believed he had escaped. They believed Catherine had killed an impostor and was hiding the real emperor in a monastery, or in Poland, or in Holstein, where his German family came from. Within months of the official death, false Peters began to appear across the empire. There were at least 6 of them between 1762 and 1773. Each one was caught quickly and either flogged to death, exiled to Siberia, or sent to the salt mines. Pugachev was the 7th. And Pugachev was different. He had 3 things the others did not. First,
He had charisma. Witnesses describe him as a man with a magnetic, unsettling stare, a man who could make rough soldiers weep when he spoke of justice. Second, he had timing. When he announced himself in 1773, the Yike Cossacks were already in open rebellion against new taxes and new restrictions on their fishing rights. They were ready for a leader, any leader. And third, he had a script. He understood, in some deep instinctive way, that the peasants did not want a new czar. They wanted the old czar back, the good czar, the murdered czar. He gave them that. He showed them the scar on his chest, the bayonet wound from his army days, and told them it was the wound of the assassin's blade at Ropsha. He had escaped, he said. He had been hidden by loyal monks for 11 years. And now he had returned to take back his throne and free the serfs. The fire spread faster than any government could believe. Within 6 months, Pugachev had 30,000 men under arms. Within a year, he had taken the city of Kazan on the Volga, one of the most important cities of the Russian East. He had captured artillery, magazines of gunpowder, banners. He had set up a chancellery. He had appointed his own ministers. He had issued manifestos in the name of His Imperial Majesty Peter III, written in the awkward, half-literate Russian of a Cossack scribe, but signed with all the pomp of an emperor. Manifestos that promised the abolition of serfdom, manifestos that promised free salt, free land, freedom of religion, manifestos that called the entire nobility of Russia traitors to the throne and ordered them killed wherever they were found. And they were killed. The Pugachev Rebellion is one of the bloodiest events of the 18th century in Europe. Thousands of Russian landowners, their wives, their children, their servants, were dragged out of their estates by Pugachev's men and hanged from trees, impaled, burned alive in their own houses. Entire districts of European Russia, by the autumn of 1774, were under rebel control. Empress Catherine in St. Petersburg was so frightened that she considered, briefly, fleeing the capital. She wrote to Voltaire that she barely slept. She referred to Pugachev in private letters as the Marquis of Pugachev, refusing even to give him the dignity of his real name. Now, you have to ask, did anyone really believe he was Peter III? Up close, no. Pugachev was illiterate. The real Peter had spoken fluent French and German. Pugachev had a thick Don Cossack accent. He could not write his own manifestos. He had a Cossack wife and Cossack children whom he sometimes had to disavow as merely his serving people. The educated rebels around him knew exactly what he was. They were using him. But for the masses, far away from his tent, in the villages, it did not matter. The peasants did not need him to be Peter III, in fact. They needed him to be Peter III in story. And he was. He was the dead, good Tsar, returned. He was the proof that God had not abandoned the poor. He was, for 2 years, the most dangerous man in Europe. It ended in 1874, in September, when Pugachev's own officers, exhausted, defeated, surrounded by Catherine's General Suvorov, betrayed him in exchange for a pardon. They tied him up. They handed him over. He was placed in an iron cage, a real cage, like an animal, and transported across Russia to Moscow, where he was tried by a special commission. He was sentenced to be quartered alive. Catherine, in a gesture she considered merciful, ordered that he be beheaded first, before the quartering. On the 10th of January 1775, in Bolotnaya Square in Moscow, Yemelyan Pugachev was executed. But here is the strange detail. Before his execution, he was asked by the chief investigator, Pavel Potemkin, one final question. Potemkin asked him, on the record, to admit that he had never been Tsar Peter III. Pugachev admitted it. He confessed in writing. He named himself as Yemelyan Ivanovich, son of Ivan, of the Zimoveyskaya Stanitsa. And then, according to the eyewitness account of one of the guards present at the interrogation, Pugachev looked up at Potemkin and said one more sentence. He said, "It does not matter. They will believe what they want to believe." He was right. Within 5 years of his execution,
Peasants in remote villages of the Urals were already telling each other that Pugachev had escaped from the cage on the road to Moscow, that the man executed in Bolotnaya Square had been a substitute, that the real Pugachev, who was the real Peter III, was hiding in the forests, gathering strength, and would return. Catherine, who understood propaganda better than almost any ruler in history, made a decision after Pugachev's execution that tells you how seriously she took this. She ordered that the very name of the river where the rebellion had started, the Yaik, be erased from all maps and replaced with a new name, the Ural. She ordered that Pugachev's birth village be destroyed and rebuilt on the other side of the river under a different name. She ordered that all references to his rebellion in official documents be marked as the rebellion of the Marquis of Pugachev, never as a peasant war, never as anything that might suggest legitimacy. She tried to erase him. She could not. The folder is still here. 3 folders down, 3 more to go. The candle is shorter than it was. Stay close. The 4th folder is thinner than the others. Inside it, there is a black and white photograph of a young woman with sad, frightened eyes, and a folded document in German with a stamp from a Berlin police station, dated the 18th of February, 1920. This is the folder of the woman who jumped into the Landwehr Canal. That night, the 17th of February, 1920, a Berlin police constable on his patrol heard a splash from the Bendler Bridge. He ran to the railing. In the dark water below, a woman was struggling. He pulled her out. She was small, thin, soaking wet, half-conscious. She had no papers. She had no money. She would not give her name. She would not say where she had come from. She was admitted that night to the Elizabeth Hospital, and from there, when she still refused to speak, to the Dahldorf Asylum on the outskirts of Berlin, where she would remain for 2 years. She kept silent for almost a year. The nurses called her Fräulein Unbekannt, the unknown miss. And then, in the autumn of 1921, another patient at Dahldorf, a Polish woman who read illustrated newspapers, brought back to the ward a magazine with an article about the Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the article mentioned, in a small line near the end, that there had long been rumors among Russian émigrés that one of the daughters had survived. Fräulein Unbekannt looked at the magazine. She looked at the photograph of Anastasia, the youngest daughter, who would have been 17 at the time of the murder. And the next time the doctors questioned her, she said, finally, that she was Anastasia Nikolaevna Romanova. She said she had survived the massacre. She said a soldier named Tchaikovsky had pulled her, wounded but alive, from the pile of bodies in the cellar and smuggled her out of Russia to Romania, where she had borne his child. And from there, she had come to Berlin, where she had lost the child, and where, in despair, she had jumped into the canal. This was the beginning of the longest royal impostor case in modern history. She would later be known to the world as Anna Anderson. She lived for 64 more years after that night on the bridge. She became, between the wars and after, one of the most famous and most argued about women in the world. Books were written about her. Lawsuits were filed in her name in German courts that lasted more than 30 years and produced thousands of pages of testimony. She lived in Germany, in Switzerland, in the United States. She married, very late in life, an eccentric American historian named Jack Manahan. She died in 1984 in a hospital in Charlottesville, Virginia, still insisting, with the same flat, exhausted certainty she had used in 1922, that she was the youngest daughter of the last Russian Tsar. Why did so many people believe her? Look at the file. There are 3 categories of evidence that her supporters built up over 6 decades. The first was physical. She was the right height. She was the right age. She had the same color of eyes. She had a deformity of 1 foot, hallux valgus, which was known to have afflicted Anastasia. She had scars on her body that some witnesses said matched the bayonet wounds reported in the Yekaterinburg cellar. She had a particular childhood scar behind one ear that several Russians who had known the imperial family at close quarters confirmed was identical to one Anastasia had carried since the age of 6. The second was behavioral. She knew small details of life inside the Romanov court that, her supporters argued, no imposter could have learned. She knew the layout of certain rooms in the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo. She knew the nicknames the four sisters had used for each other. She recognized on sight certain old courtiers and old ladies-in-waiting who came to visit her in Berlin and Switzerland, including some who had not been photographed publicly. She wept, several witnesses recorded, at certain pieces of music that had been favorites of the imperial family. The third was the testimony of the believers, and these were not all eccentrics. Several members of the extended Russian royal family, after meeting her, declared themselves convinced. Tatiana Botkina Melnik, the daughter of Dr. Eugene Botkin, who had been the Romanov family physician and who had been murdered with them in the cellar, met Anna Anderson and said, without hesitation, "This is Anastasia." Princess Xenia Georgievna of Russia, a cousin of the murdered children, met her in 1928 and supported her for the rest of her life. The composer Sergei Rachmaninoff helped pay her medical bills. The actress Lillian Gish believed her. Pierre Gilliard, the Swiss tutor of the imperial children, did not believe her, but his wife, the former imperial nursery maid, was less certain and refused to make a public denial. There was a counter-camp, equally convinced she was a fraud. Most of the surviving Romanovs, particularly the Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, the aunt of the murdered children, refused to recognize her after meeting her. They said her German was too good and her Russian too poor. They said her gestures were wrong. They said her face, looked at carefully, was not the face. They produced a competing theory that she was in fact a Polish factory worker named Franziska Szenskowska, who had vanished in Berlin a few weeks before the canal incident and whose family had been searching for her. The German courts, after the longest civil case in German history, ruled in 1970 that the question could not be decided either way on the available evidence. Neither identity, Romanov or Szenskowska, could be proved to a legal standard. She died in 1984. And here, friend, is where the story would have ended forever, in mystery, if not for one thing: tissue. After her death in Charlottesville, a small portion of intestinal tissue from a surgery she had undergone earlier was preserved at the Martha Jefferson Hospital. 5 centimeters of tissue in a paraffin block on a shelf, almost forgotten. In the early 1990s, after the bodies of the Romanov family were finally exhumed in the forest near Yekaterinburg, geneticists at the Forensic Science Service in Aldermaston, in England, asked whether they could test that tissue. Permission was granted. The DNA from the tissue was compared, first, to DNA samples taken from the bones of the Romanov skeletons in Yekaterinburg. There was no match. The tissue did not belong to any member of the Russian imperial family. The DNA was then compared to a sample provided, voluntarily, by a man named Karl Maucher in Germany. Karl Maucher was the great-nephew of Franziska Szenskowska, the missing Polish factory worker. The match was clear. The mitochondrial DNA passed down through the female line was identical. Anna Anderson was Franziska Szenskowska, the Polish factory worker who had jumped into the Landwehr Canal in February 1920 after, it later emerged, suffering a head injury in a munitions factory accident that may have caused permanent partial amnesia and personality change. 64 years, hundreds of believers, lawsuits, books, films, lives reorganized around her. A whole subculture of Russian émigrés who built their identity around the possibility that she was real. And in the end, she was a frightened, brain-injured, deeply troubled woman from a Pomeranian village who had read a magazine article in an asylum in 1921 and seen, in the photograph of a dead girl, a way out of being no one. Look at the photograph in this folder. Look at her eyes. Tell me whether she ever knew, herself, in the long, quiet years between the lawsuits, whether she remembered who she really was, or whether the story had eaten her, the way these stories eat everyone who tells them long enough. I do not know. I do not think the file knows either. Close it. The fifth folder is small. It is small because the story inside it is short. But it is important because it shows you something about how easy it was, in the right century, to put a crown on a child's head. The folder belongs to a boy named Lambert Simnel. He was, when this story begins, 10 years old. To understand what happened to him, you need to understand the wreckage of a dynasty. In August of 1485, on a field in the English Midlands called Bosworth, the last Plantagenet king of England, Richard III, was killed in battle by a Welsh exile named Henry Tudor. Henry was crowned Henry VII that autumn. He had only the thinnest claim to the throne. His ancestry on his mother's side traced back to a legitimized but technically barred branch of the royal family, and his ancestry on his father's side traced back to a Welsh squire who had married a French dowager queen. He held the throne in 1485 and 1486 by one thing only: the fact that he had won at Bosworth and the previous king was dead in a ditch. But there were other royal children alive in England, real ones. The two sons of the previous king before Richard, the boys we now call the princes in the Tower, had vanished from the Tower of London in 1483 under circumstances that have never been solved. They were almost certainly dead by 1485, but no body had ever been produced. Beyond them, there was Edward, Earl of Warwick. He was the 10-year-old son of George, Duke of Clarence, who had been a brother of King Edward IV. Edward of Warwick was a small boy with a real, traceable, legitimate Plantagenet claim. He was, in some genealogical sense, a more rightful king of England than Henry Tudor. Henry knew this. As soon as he was crowned, he had Edward of Warwick taken from his guardians and placed in the Tower of London, where he would remain, kept alive but invisible, for the next 14 years. Now, in 1486, in the city of Oxford, a priest named Richard Simons was teaching grammar to a boy of about 10 named Lambert Simnel. The boy was the son of, depending on which surviving record you trust, either an organ builder, a baker, or a tradesman of some kind. Common origin, nothing remarkable. But he was, witnesses said, beautiful. Fair-haired, well-formed, intelligent, and he had a kind of natural courtly grace that an observant tutor noticed. Simons had a plan. The plan was insane and almost worked. He took the boy out of Oxford. He trained him for several months in the manners and bearing of a noble child. He taught him a few stories of court life, a few names, a few rituals. And then he took him to Ireland. This is the key part. Ireland, in 1487, was overwhelmingly loyal to the Yorkist cause, which Henry Tudor had defeated. The Anglo-Irish nobility, particularly the powerful Earl of Kildare, had no love for the new Tudor king. They were ready to believe almost anything that promised them a return of the old dynasty. In Dublin, in May 1487, Simons presented Lambert Simnel as Edward, Earl of Warwick. The story Simons told was that the real Edward had escaped from the Tower of London, fled across the sea, and arrived in Ireland to raise a rebellion and reclaim his throne. The Earl of Kildare believed it. Or, more precisely, he found it useful to believe it. On the 24th of May, 1487, in Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin, with a crown taken from a statue of the Virgin Mary placed on his small head, Lambert Simnel was crowned King Edward VI of England. He was 10 years old. He was lifted onto the shoulders of a tall Irish nobleman so the crowd could see him. He was paraded through the streets. Coins were minted in his name. The new king was then placed at the head of an army. The Earl of Lincoln, the actual nephew of the previous Yorkist kings and a real claimant to the throne, sailed from the continent with 2,000 German and Swiss mercenaries, paid for by Margaret of York, the Duchess of Burgundy, who was an aunt of the murdered princes and the implacable enemy of Henry Tudor. The mercenaries joined Lincoln in Ireland. They added Irish troops to their force. And in June 1487, the entire army, with Lambert Simnel at its symbolic head, sailed across to England to overthrow Henry VII. They met Henry's army on the 16th of June, 1487, at the village of Stoke by the River Trent. The Battle of Stoke Field is sometimes called the last battle of the Wars of the Roses. It was savage. The Earl of Lincoln was killed. The German mercenary commander Martin Schwartz was killed. Most of the Irish foot soldiers, who had no armor, were slaughtered. Around 4,000 men died in a few hours. The Tudor side won, and in the wreckage, Henry Tudor's soldiers found the boy, Lambert Simnel, 10 years old, alive. Now, here is the part of the story that has fascinated historians for 500 years. Henry VII did not execute him. The priest Simons was arrested and imprisoned for life in an ecclesiastical prison, which is what was done with rebellious clergy.
The Earl of Kildare was eventually pardoned because Henry could not afford to lose the cooperation of the Anglo-Irish nobility entirely. But Lambert Simnel, the false king, the boy who had been crowned in Dublin and led an invasion of England, was given a job in the royal kitchens at Westminster. He was made a turnspit, a boy who turned the meat over the fire while it roasted. Why? Because Henry Tudor understood something about pretenders that almost no other ruler in history understood. Killing them turns them into martyrs. Killing a 10-year-old crowned king, even a fake one, would have spread the legend across Europe for a generation. It would have produced songs and ballads and saints' tales. It would have produced more pretenders, claiming to be Lambert escaped from the executioner. Instead, Henry kept him alive and visible and small. Foreign ambassadors visiting the English court were sometimes pointedly led through the kitchens so they could see the former King of England turning a roast. The story became, instantly, a humiliation rather than a tragedy. It became a joke, and jokes do not produce rebellions. Lambert Simnel grew up in the royal kitchens. He was eventually promoted to falconer, which was a more dignified position, and he served the Tudor household for the rest of his life. He died around 1525, in his late 40s, having lived under 3 Tudor kings, the man who had defeated him, and that man's 2 sons. He was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in London. The boy who was crowned king in Dublin Cathedral in 1487 died as a falconer in 1525. There are no portraits of him. There is no monument. There is no sword, no banner, no memoir. There is only this folder, with 1 sheet of vellum inside it, recording the wages paid by the royal household in 1493 to one Lambert Simnel, kitchen servant, 12 pence per week. Here's the small thing that I want you to notice. Look at this folder. There is a small smudge in the lower corner of the wage record. Some scholars believe, though they cannot prove it, that this smudge is a thumbprint left by Lambert himself the day he was given his wages. If they are right, this smudge, this finger mark on parchment, is the only physical trace remaining in the world of the only 10-year-old who was ever crowned King of England by mistake. A thumbprint is what is left when an empire decides it does not want a martyr. Close it. Stay with me. The last folder is the heaviest. It tells the story of a man who was so good at being a dead prince that he almost broke the diplomacy of all of Western Europe. His name was Perkin Warbeck. He was, when this story begins, around 17 years old, and he was, at first, only a servant. In the autumn of 1491, in the port city of Cork in Ireland, a Breton merchant named Pierre-Jean Menot arrived from the continent with a load of silk and fine cloth. He had with him, as his servant or apprentice, a young man named Perkin. Perkin was tall. Perkin was elegant. Perkin had been educated in Tournai and in Antwerp and in Lisbon in the ways of the great commercial houses of Northern Europe. He spoke Flemish, French, and increasingly good English. He had, witnesses recorded, an unusual grace of bearing for a tradesman's apprentice. He had soft hands. He carried himself, when he forgot to slump, like a courtier. When Menot's ship docked at Cork, Perkin walked through the streets of the city wearing his master's silks, because his master had asked him to model the cloth as a kind of advertisement. The local people of Cork, the same Yorkist-leaning Anglo-Irish who had crowned Lambert Simnel 4 years earlier and were still bitter about losing at Stoke Field,
looked at this beautiful young man in royal silk, and they saw what they wanted to see. A small group approached him. They asked him, plainly, whether he was the Earl of Warwick. Perkin, by his own later confession, said he was not. They asked him then whether he was perhaps a bastard son of Richard III. He said he was not. They asked him, finally, whether he might be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes who had vanished from the Tower of London 8 years earlier. There is a moment in this story that the records cannot explain. We do not know, and will never know, exactly what was said in that conversation in Cork. What we know is what happened next. Within weeks, Perkin Warbeck was no longer a Breton apprentice. He was Richard of York, the second son of King Edward IV, the younger of the murdered princes, who had escaped his uncle's assassins, been smuggled out of the Tower, raised in secret on the continent, and was now returning to claim his throne. He played the part for the next 8 years, and he played it so well that the courts of Europe took him seriously. The list of monarchs and powers who, at one time or another, recognized Perkin Warbeck as the rightful King of England is astonishing. King Charles VIII of France received him at the French court in 1492, treated him as a royal personage, lodged him at the Hôtel des Tournelles in Paris, and gave him a guard of honor. Margaret of York, Duchess of Burgundy, the aunt of the real Richard of York, met Perkin in Malines in 1493 and embraced him publicly as her nephew, weeping, declaring that she recognized in his face the face of her dead brother, King Edward. Maximilian of Habsburg, the King of the Romans and future Holy Roman Emperor, received him at his court at Vienna and treated him as an exiled monarch. King James IV of Scotland not only received him, but gave him in marriage one of his own kinswomen, Lady Catherine Gordon, a beautiful young noblewoman whose family was related by blood to the Scottish royal house. Imagine this. A young man whom we now know was the son of a Tournai boatman, married into the Scottish royal family, recognized by the Holy Roman Emperor, given a guard of honor by the King of France, embraced as her own blood by the Duchess of Burgundy. For 8 years. Why did they all believe him? 3 reasons. First, he looked the part. Surviving descriptions of Perkin emphasize, again and again, his blonde hair, his fair skin, his blue eyes, his height, his slight build. Edward IV had been a famously handsome blonde king. The real Richard of York would have inherited those features. Perkin was, by the freak of biology, almost exactly what people expected the prince to look like. Second, he had been coached. By whom, we do not know completely, but we know that some of the Yorkist exiles on the continent, men like Sir Edward Brampton, who had been the godfather of the real Richard of York and a close servant of Edward IV, took Perkin in for months at a time. Brampton in particular is suspected of having taught him the small, intimate details of life inside the Yorkist royal household. Names of servants, names of dogs, anecdotes of the nursery, the geography of certain rooms, the kind of details that a real prince would know and that no random Flemish boy could possibly invent. Third, and most important, the European powers wanted him to be real. France was at war, intermittently, with England. Burgundy hated the Tudors. Scotland feared the Tudors. The Holy Roman Empire was always looking for ways to apply pressure on its rival kingdoms. A pretender who could destabilize Henry VII was, regardless of his actual identity, a useful weapon. Several of the rulers who recognized Perkin almost certainly knew, or strongly suspected, that he was a fraud. They recognized him anyway, because the fraud was useful. Henry VII himself spent enormous resources on this affair. He had spies across Europe trying to track Perkin. He bribed officials to get a glimpse of him. He pressed the courts that sheltered him with diplomatic protests. He eventually identified, by sending agents to Tournai, Perkin's real family. His real father, John Osbeck, alias Verbeck, was a boatman of Tournai. His real mother, Catherine de Faro, was a local woman. He had brothers. He had been baptized in the Church of Saint Jean. His name was Pierchon de Verbeck, anglicized as Perkin Warbeck. But knowing his real identity did not help Henry while Perkin was still on the continent, under the protection of foreign monarchs. Perkin invaded England twice. Both times he failed. The first invasion, in 1495, landed at Deal in Kent. His advance party went ashore. The local Kentish men, instead of rising to support him, attacked the landing party and killed or captured most of them. Perkin himself, watching from a ship offshore, had the good sense to weigh anchor and sail away. The second attempt, in 1497, landed in Cornwall, where there was a genuine peasant revolt already underway against Tudor taxation. Perkin took advantage of the chaos. He proclaimed himself King Richard IV at Bodmin. He gathered a few thousand Cornishmen. He marched east. And outside the city of Taunton, when he not execute him at first. Just as with Lambert Simnel, Henry understood that a martyr was more dangerous than a fool. He kept Perkin alive at court, paraded him through London on a horse so the crowds could see him, made him write out and sign a long, elaborate confession of who he really was, and lodged him under loose guard in the royal household. He even allowed Lady Catherine Gordon, Perkin's young Scottish wife who had been captured with him, to remain at court as a lady-in-waiting to the Tudor queen. She would survive Perkin by more than 40 years and live to a wealthy old age in England. But Perkin Warbeck made a mistake that Lambert Simnel had not made. Lambert had accepted his fate as a kitchen boy. Perkin could not. He tried to escape twice. The second time, in 1499, he attempted to escape from the Tower of London, together with the now 24-year-old Edward, Earl of Warwick, the real Yorkist prince who had been imprisoned there, untouched, for 14 years. The escape attempt was almost certainly an entrapment, set up by the Tudor authorities themselves to provide a legal excuse for what came next. Both men were betrayed, recaptured, tried for treason, and condemned. On the 23rd of November 1499, Perkin Warbeck was hanged at Tyburn. On the 28th of November 1499, Edward, Earl of Warwick, the last Plantagenet prince of the senior line, was beheaded on Tower Hill. Henry Tudor had finally cleaned the board. The false prince and the real prince died in the same week. Now look closely at this folder. Inside it, there is one document. It is the confession that Henry forced Perkin to sign in 1497. In it, Perkin admits he is Pierre-Jean de Verbeck of Tournai, son of a boatman, recruited by Yorkist exiles to play the part of Richard of York. But look at the very bottom of the page, beneath the signature. There is a small marginal note in different handwriting, in Latin, in a 16th century hand. It is one line. Translated, it reads, "He wept the whole time he wrote this, and would not say if he wept for the lie or the truth." Hope is the strongest evidence we have, and the worst. That sentence belongs to all 6 of them. To Alexander, who may or may not have walked away from his crown to live as a hermit. To Sebastian, whose subjects watched the Western Sea for 3 centuries. To Pugachev, who said in the cage that they would believe what they wanted to believe. To Anna Anderson, who jumped into a Berlin canal with no name and was assigned one by the photograph in a magazine. To Lambert, the boy who turned the spit. To Perkin, who wept while he signed his real name. Power abhors a vacuum. When a ruler vanishes without a clearly identifiable body, the empty space fills instantly. With saints, with impostors, with hope, with riot. The crowd will crown almost anyone, as long as the king is said to have come back. I am closing the cabinet now. The brass lock is older than any of these stories. It has been forced open many times. It will be forced open again. Before you go, I have something for you. Reach out your hand. This is a silver medallion. It is thin, tarnished, slightly bent, as though it had once been carried in a pocket for a very long time. On the front, you will see a portrait. Look closely. The portrait is empty. Where the face should be, there is only a smooth oval of silver, polished by handling, blank. This medallion was found in 1886 in a small wooden box in a cell that had once been occupied by Fyodor Kuzmich, the hermit of Tomsk. It had no inscription, it had no date. The portrait, if there had ever been one, had been deliberately filed away, perhaps by the hermit himself, perhaps by someone before him. Keep it for me. Carry it in your pocket. Some night, when you are alone, take it out and look at the empty face, and ask yourself what kind of man, having once been the most powerful ruler in Europe, would carry with him for 38 years into a hut in Siberia a portrait of himself with the face filed off. Then ask yourself one more thing. 6 folders, 6 false deaths, 6 men and women who walked out of their own funerals, in fact or in legend, and lived inside someone else's story. I have shown you all 6. I have closed the cabinet, but the candle is still burning. The room is still cold, and one of them, friend, is still in this room with you. I will not tell you which one. That is for the next folder on a different night. Until then, watch the Western Sea. Watch the strangers who arrive in your village without papers.
Watch the beautiful young man who wears silk that does not belong to him. Watch the woman pulled from the canal who will not say her name. And if any of them remind you of someone you once buried, do not be the first to greet them. Do not be the first to weep. Do not be the first to kneel. Because hope is the strongest evidence we have, and the worst. Good night.